What do you do when the life you built crumbles overnight? For Jim, losing everything wasn't the end, it was the start of a fight he never saw coming. Jim Carlyle had always seen himself as a man who lived by a strong set of values. Growing up in a quiet Midwestern town, he learned about dedication and trust from his parents, who ran a small hardware store. His father's voice often echoed in his thoughts during tough moments: trust is built one small step at a time, but it can be destroyed in a single moment. Those words stayed with Jim, shaping how he approached life. At 27, Jim met Linda during a local charity event. She was full of life and ambition, a striking contrast to Jim's calm and reserved nature. Despite their differences, they connected instantly, and after 2 years of dating, they tied the knot, each carrying dreams of building a loving, stable family. Jim began working as an aircraft mechanic, a job that demanded long hours but promised security. Meanwhile, Linda pursued a career in event planning, channeling her creativity and energy into her work. To those who knew them, their life seemed picture-perfect. They had 2 wonderful children, Emma and Tommy, whose cheerful voices filled their home with joy. But as time went on, the pressures of life began to strain their marriage. Jim's demanding job left him drained, while Linda's expanding social circle pulled her away from family life. Tensions grew, and disagreements became common, though they always tried to shield the kids from their arguments. Things came to a head during a particularly rough patch. Jim was under intense pressure to meet a critical work deadline, and Linda was fully engrossed in handling an important, high-maintenance client. Their ability to communicate all but broke down. One evening, Linda didn't come home after a work event. She later explained that she had stayed at a colleague's place, claiming exhaustion. Though Jim felt a pang of suspicion, he chose to suppress it, unwilling to confront what he feared might be the truth. That uneasy peace didn't last long. A few months later, while looking for their son's missing tablet, Jim stumbled across a series of text messages on Linda's phone. The messages made it painfully clear: she was involved with another man. Shocked and hurt, Jim confronted Linda, which led to a heated argument. Linda, feeling cornered, accused Jim of being emotionally distant and claimed she had become trapped in the dull routine of their marriage. Jim begged her to consider counseling, but Linda refused, insisting that it was too late to fix what was broken. In the weeks that followed, Linda's behavior grew more erratic. She started spending nights away from home without offering any explanations, leaving Jim struggling to hold the family together. Jim was left to care for the children alone. The final blow came when Linda brought up the idea of separating, claiming she needed freedom and space to rediscover herself. The emotional toll on Jim was overwhelming, but despite the heartache, he made a promise to himself: he would stay strong for Emma and Tommy. Yet as Linda's absences became more frequent and her emotional distance grew more obvious, Jim felt as though his once stable family was crumbling right before his eyes. Despair began to consume him. His marriage was over, and with it, the life he had worked so hard to build seemed to unravel in an instant. The emptiness left behind was unbearable, and each passing moment seemed to add more weight to the void in his heart. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. Why had Linda chosen this path? How could she walk away from everything they had built together? His mind raced with endless questions, but no answers surfaced. Only confusion and sorrow remained, leaving him to confront the broken pieces of his life alone. After leaving Morrison's restaurant, Jim trudged back to the hotel. He gathered his belongings but didn't touch Linda's. "Let's see if she even notices her stuff is gone," he muttered bitterly. Her clothes, her makeup, she had already left so much behind, including him. After checking out, he got into his Ford Explorer and drove home. Pulling up next to the old F-150 in the driveway, he stared at the house. It no longer felt like home, it felt like a graveyard of memories. With a sneer, he thought, "This place is more of a tomb now, and I'm just the ghost haunting it." Inside, silence greeted him like a stifling fog. It wasn't the comforting kind of quiet, it was heavy, suffocating. Dropping onto the couch, Jim felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. Tears welled up and flowed freely as he sobbed, unable to contain the overwhelming grief. Thoughts of Emma and Tommy pierced through him, making the pain even sharper. He had tried to protect them, to shield them from the growing tension and distance, but now he feared they too would feel the void that Linda's absence had created. He sat there for what felt like hours, lost in the depths of his sorrow, spiraling further into despair with each passing second. Eventually, something inside him broke. Without thinking, he stumbled toward the bar, grabbed a bottle of whiskey, and in a fit of frustration, smashed the neck of the bottle against the counter. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the empty house, a reflection of the chaos within him. Jim took a swig of the whiskey. The harsh burn didn't bring any comfort, it only left his hands trembling. Fueled by a mix of despair and fury, he grabbed his laptop and logged into their joint bank accounts. With cold determination, he methodically drained each one, transferring every dollar into his personal account. The savings, the vacation fund, and the household budget, every last cent vanished in a matter of minutes. When he finally stopped, the balance read $17,635.38. He stared at the figure, a grim smirk forming on his lips. Revenge on a budget, he muttered under his breath. He left a few dollars behind in two of the accounts, just enough to keep them open, before shutting down the rest. But Jim wasn't finished. His next move was more symbolic. He sat down and drafted two letters, one addressed to his mother and the other to Linda's parents. Both letters spelled out the details of Linda's betrayal and explained his decision to walk away. Once the letters were done, he walked to the dining table and laid out a place setting for one. Using ketchup, he created a crude splash across the empty plate, then stuck a knife in the middle for dramatic effect. He stepped back, surveyed the scene, and muttered to himself, "Perfect." It was his final statement, a bitter farewell to the life he was leaving behind. Satisfied, Jim gathered his gear. He loaded up his F-150 with camping supplies, fishing equipment, gas cans, and ammo, preparing for an extended escape. Before leaving, he unplugged the fridge, propped the doors open, and cut the power to the house. He wanted to make it clear, this was the end. Yet, as he stood in the doorway, doubt began to creep in. Thoughts of Emma and Tommy surfaced, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. "Am I doing the right thing?" he whispered aloud, though the silence gave no answer. For a brief moment, hesitation gripped him, but he shook it off. Gritting his teeth, he climbed into the truck and started the engine, driving off without a glance back. With each mile that passed, the grief that had consumed him began to harden into something else, something cold and unyielding. Later that night, Jim sat across from his friend, an older man known simply as LW. His face was somber as he listened to Jim's story. When Jim finally finished, LW let out a heavy sigh and asked gently, "So, what do you want to do?" Jim's eyes narrowed, his expression steely. "Disappear," he said flatly. "No divorce, no legal battles. I'm done. She didn't think twice before walking out on me, so I'll do the same." "And your kids?" LW pressed, his voice soft but firm. "What about Emma and Tommy?" Jim's expression darkened at the question. "What about them?" he shot back, bitterness evident in his tone. "Are they even mine? She's only cared about herself all along." His fists clenched, and his voice trembled with barely restrained anger. "You know what I really want? I want to wake up and find out this was just a horrible dream. But it's not. And I won't sit in some room while a therapist lectures me about forgiveness or tries to guilt me into thinking about the kids." His words hung in the air, heavy with pain and finality. Jim had made up his mind. He wasn't looking for advice, he was looking for a way out. "She's the one who ruined this family," Jim said, his voice hardening with finality. "And I'm done." LW stayed silent, letting Jim's bitterness settle in the room like a cold, heavy fog. Jim exhaled sharply, the tension in his body easing just slightly as his tone turned eerily calm. If my life's in pieces, hers will be too. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, the overcast clouds matching Jim's mood perfectly. What once felt oppressive now seemed fitting, as though nature itself was reflecting the somber weight of his unraveling life. Without wasting any more time, Jim climbed into his truck and drove straight to the bank. He withdrew nearly all his savings, leaving just enough in his checking account to keep it open. At a nearby gas station, he filled both his truck's main and auxiliary tanks, then added 2 jerry cans of fuel to the back for good measure. His next destination was an internet cafe. There, he uploaded the letters he had drafted earlier, sending them to his mother, Linda's parents, and even a couple of local news outlets. He wanted to make sure the story of Linda's betrayal wouldn't be quietly swept under the rug. Once that was done, he took a few minutes to browse the bulletin board in the cafe, looking for something, anything, that might offer a way out, a clean break from the life he was trying to leave behind. That's when he spotted it, a simple flyer pinned among dozens of other ads. It was a job listing for a handyman on a small farm. No background checks, no references required. Just an honest day's work for someone willing to get their hands dirty. For the first time in days, Jim felt a flicker of hope. The ad's simplicity hinted at something he desperately needed, a chance to disappear and start over. He tore the paper from the board and headed for a nearby diner, where he hoped to make a call. Walking in, he noticed an older black woman behind the counter, her kind eyes and easy smile immediately easing some of his tension. Her name tag read Sally. "Well, hello there," she greeted warmly. "What can I get you?" Jim held up the flyer. "This job still available?" he asked. Sally didn't glance at the paper. Instead, she gave him a once-over, her gaze sharp but not unkind, as if sizing him up. After a moment, she said with a knowing smile, "You look like a man who's been through something. Don't be shy, take a seat." Jim hesitated, but he appreciated her straightforward manner. Before he could respond, a man and woman approached from behind the counter. The woman introduced herself with a warm handshake. "Hello, I'm May, and this is my husband, Joshua." She turned to Joshua and added playfully, "Say hello, Joshua." "Hello, Joshua," he muttered, his eyes fixed on Jim. May smiled and motioned for Jim to follow them to a back booth. Once seated, she leaned in and asked bluntly, "What's your name, where are you from, and why are you here?" Caught off guard by her directness, Jim hesitated before handing over his driver's license. He offered a brief, vague explanation, deliberately keeping details light. "Are you married?" May pressed. "Yes," Jim admitted reluctantly. "Kids?" she asked. Jim paused for a moment, his mind flashing to Emma and Tommy. He didn't answer right away, instead shutting the door on the painful memories and following May's lead as she motioned him forward. It was the first time Jim had seen Joshua crack a smile, and the image lingered in his mind longer than he expected. But just as quickly as it appeared, Joshua's grin faded, and his expression returned to its usual seriousness. Sliding into his Jeep, Joshua cast a quick glance at Jim before pulling out of the parking lot. Jim started his truck and followed closely behind, the Marine Corps and American flag decals on the back of Joshua's vehicle guiding him through the twisting backroads. Among the faded stickers was something else, a worn Vietnamese flag, likely dating back to the 1970s, hinting at stories Joshua hadn't yet shared. After about a half hour of driving, they arrived at a modest property tucked away from the main road. The small house looked unassuming, but its surroundings were peaceful, the kind of place that seemed untouched by time. Jim stepped out of his truck and took in the scene, a wooden front porch, a narrow gravel driveway, and a well-maintained garden out front. The house itself was simple, yet there was something warm and inviting about it. Inside, the space felt cozy despite its modest size. A ceiling fan turned lazily overhead in both the living room and the bedroom, while a freestanding wood stove in the corner provided the only source of heat. The low ceilings and well-insulated walls made the 1,200 square foot home feel snug, almost like a retreat from the outside world. Jim scanned the room, appreciating its simplicity, though deep down, he couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. This isn't for me, he thought grimly, shaking off the feeling and forcing himself to focus. I'll take it, Jim said, turning to Joshua, his voice steady. But Joshua raised a hand, stopping him before he could say more. Not so fast. How are you planning to pay? Do you have a job lined up? Not yet, Jim admitted, his jaw tightening. He hated being questioned, but he couldn't deny Joshua had a right to ask. Joshua studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. We'll figure something out. Over the next few hours, Jim learned more about Joshua's past than he had expected. Joshua shared how he had met his wife, May, during his military deployment. She and her family had faced dire circumstances, and with the help of Catholic charities, they were relocated to the Philippines before eventually resettling in the United States. Joshua had been drawn to May's strength and resilience, keeping in touch with her after returning home. Years later, they reconnected in Oceanside, California, and despite opposition from his family, Joshua converted to Catholicism and married her. They eventually moved to Paris Island, where Joshua continued his military career. Though Joshua's life had moved on, the scars of his past lingered. Sharing his story brought a measure of understanding but offered little closure. When May heard about Jim's situation, her reaction was one of disbelief. How could someone do that to their own kids, she exclaimed, only to quickly catch herself. I'm sorry, Jim. That was insensitive. Jim's face darkened, his expression hardening. I care about my kids, May, but I can't even be sure they're mine, he said, bitterness seeping into his voice. Believing that would mean trusting her. May offered a gentle, understanding smile. I don't know your wife, Jim, but I do know one thing. No matter how things end, your kids will always need their dad. I understand, and I'm sorry, Jim said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. Joshua, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, his tone calm yet firm. You're broken, son. Jim didn't respond, but those words lingered. He wasn't sure whether they comforted or cut deeper, yet he couldn't deny their truth. Before he could dwell on it, his thoughts were interrupted by the memory of the confrontation earlier that day, a moment that still left his heart pounding. It had happened in the grocery store parking lot. Jim had just finished loading a few bags into his truck when he noticed something off, a commotion near a parked car. Two men were harassing a woman, who was frantically trying to open the back door of her vehicle. It wasn't until Jim got closer that he saw why. There was a small child strapped into a car seat inside. Without hesitation, Jim stepped in. He grabbed the injured man and shoved him into his accomplice, slamming both against the side of the car. The first doubled over in pain, clutching his wrist, while the second groaned as he held his ribs and crumpled to the ground. The woman, still crying, managed to open the door and check on her child, who was thankfully unharmed. Pulling out his phone, Jim quickly called his friend. Mike, I need backup. Grocery store parking lot. Possible robbery, or worse. Stay put, we're on our way, Michael replied without hesitation. By the time the situation was under control, word had spread fast. Small-town life had its own way of making news travel quicker than you'd expect. Later that afternoon, as Jim walked into the diner, he was greeted with knowing looks. Sally, standing behind the counter, couldn't hide her amusement. Mike mentioned the incident on the radio, she said, chuckling. Looks like Mr. Nice Guy here is already famous. Well done, Jim, I knew you were one of the good ones. Jim felt a flush of embarrassment as Sally continued to tease him, enjoying herself at his expense. He was starting to realize that in a small town, even a single act of bravery could turn you into a local celebrity. Before he could respond, two older men entered the diner. They greeted Sally warmly before their eyes landed on Jim and Emma, who had joined him at the booth. One of the men removed his Vietnam veteran cap and approached Jim with a proud smile. "Good job, young man," he said, extending his hand. "It's good to see people like you around." Jim shook the man's hand, offering a modest nod. "Just did what anyone would have done." After the men left, Emma smiled and shifted the conversation to something more personal. "So, Mr. Carlyle, let me tell you a bit about myself. I'm 29, been divorced for 3 years now. My ex-husband was abusive, he went to prison and, well, he passed away last year. My sister handled my divorce, it was actually one of her first cases." Her voice softened as she glanced briefly at Linda's name on Jim's phone, clearly mindful of her words. "Now, I'm a licensed accountant specializing in estate planning and investments. I co-own a firm with my best friend, and we've got a notary, secretary, and a small but busy office." Jim listened intently, noting the strength in Emma's tone despite the difficult past she had just shared. He nodded, offering a small, encouraging smile. "Sounds like you've done well for yourself." Emma returned the nod. "I've tried." Then, sensing he was holding back, she added, "It's your turn now." Jim hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. He began sharing his story, carefully recounting the betrayal he had endured, the painful decision to leave, and the difficult years that followed. Though he avoided the harshest details, he didn't shy away from the truth. As he finished, he admitted, "I'm not proud of how I handled things, but at the time, it felt like my only option. I didn't see another way out back then," Jim admitted, his voice quieter now. "But talking about it here, it feels like a weight's being lifted off my chest. I know it sounds cliché, but it's true." Emma listened intently, her expression softening as Jim spoke. Her eyes reflected empathy, but there was also something more, a faint, almost imperceptible spark of hope, perhaps even happiness. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Jim to notice, and it made him feel lighter. As weeks turned into months, Jim found himself crossing paths with Emma more often. Sometimes it was by chance, other times it felt more intentional, like their lives had begun to naturally intertwine. They even shared a few casual outings, often ending up at the local ice cream parlor. Slowly but surely, with Emma's quiet presence and encouragement, Jim began to feel more like himself again. The bitterness that had weighed him down for so long began to loosen its grip. One Thursday morning, Jim learned about a barbecue at the Lel's place, scheduled for the following evening. He hadn't been planning on going, but when he received a personal invitation, he figured it might do him some good. Grateful for the gesture, he decided to take Saturday off, knowing the night would likely involve good food, a few drinks, and plenty of conversation. Friday evening came quickly, and Jim stuck to his usual routine for most of the day. But as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and red, he made his way over to the Lel's home. The backyard buzzed with life, friends gathered around, kids playing, the scent of grilled meat wafting through the air. As he settled in, Angie, one of the hosts, approached him. Her expression was friendly but held a hint of seriousness. "Hey, Jim, can we talk? There's something I think you should know." Jim blinked in surprise. Sure," he said hesitantly. "Now. If you're free," she said, gently taking his hand and guiding him toward a shaded table beneath a large tree. Before he could process what was happening, Mike and Camille joined them, both grinning as if they were in on some private joke. They led Jim to the table, where warm handshakes and a round of drinks awaited. Mike handed Jim a cold Budweiser while the women opted for white wine. "You might need this," Mike said with a chuckle, "but pace yourself." Jim accepted the beer with a nod, taking a sip while Angie leaned forward, her tone growing more serious. "There's something you need to know about what happened after you left." Jim stiffened, suddenly uneasy. "What do you mean?" Angie took a steady sip of her wine before continuing. "Linda didn't take it well. After you left, she called the police, claiming it was an emergency. They arrived to find her hysterical, but when they entered the house and saw nothing truly wrong, they scolded her for wasting their time. It wasn't a good scene. Jim exhaled slowly, already feeling the tension creeping back in. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear more, but Angie pressed on. Her parents showed up not long after, furious, not just at her for the chaos, but at you for disappearing like you did. Meanwhile, the messages and emails you sent out about her went viral, and, well, it humiliated her. Linda delayed filing for divorce, blew through the money you left behind, and sank deep into debt. It took nearly 2 years before the divorce was finalized. Jim stared down at his beer, gripping the bottle tighter as Angie's words settled in. He had thought that part of his life was behind him, but hearing it all laid out again made it feel raw, like an old wound reopening. She spent 2 years unraveling, Angie added quietly. And yet, somehow, they never tracked you down. Jim's mind raced. How haven't they found me yet? He thought, a chill running down his spine. I re-registered my truck, got a new license, even paid taxes. It's not like I've been living off the grid. Mike shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of Jim's growing anxiety but unsure of what to say. The sense of safety Jim had carefully rebuilt over the past few years now felt fragile, like it could crumble at any moment. Well, I might have had something to do with that, Mike admitted, blushing slightly. When you updated your registration and license, I pulled a few strings at the DMV. Your paperwork kind of got lost, and any searches just didn't get reviewed. He glanced down, clearly embarrassed by the admission. Jim stared at him, surprised. You, what? Why? Mike shrugged awkwardly. I figured you needed a clean start, and, well, I didn't want anyone coming after you. Guess it worked. Before Jim could respond, Angelina, noticing the tension, sighed and gently nudged Mike away. Give him a minute, she said softly. Mai, offering a bit of comfort, gave Jim a brief hug before returning to sit with her parents, who were still processing everything that had just unfolded. Meanwhile, Emma led Jim down a narrow path away from the house. The forest thickened around them as they walked in silence, the sounds of the party fading behind them. 15 minutes later, they reached a fallen tree by the riverbank. The secluded spot was quiet, peaceful, perfect for a private conversation. Emma smoothed her dress and sat gracefully, motioning for Jim to join her. Come on, she said, patting the tree trunk beside her. Jim hesitated briefly before sitting down, his eyes darting around nervously. The quiet rustle of leaves and the steady flow of the river created a soothing backdrop, but he couldn't shake the weight of his thoughts. Emma noticed his unease and reached over, gently taking his hands in hers. You okay? She asked, her voice carrying a hint of affection. Caught off guard, Jim hesitated, then nodded slowly. I've been thinking about asking Angie to reach out to LW, he said finally. I want to see if there's any chance I can get custody of my kids. Linda's in rehab, unemployed, and her parents are the ones raising them right now. I don't know where I stand legally, but I can't imagine my situation is worse than hers. Emma listened intently as Jim continued, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. I want to bring my kids here, to my life now. My mom deserves to spend time with her grandkids too. But before I can do that, I need to build a house, something big enough for all of us. For the first time in years, Jim felt a spark of purpose. Over the next few days, that spark grew into a concrete plan. Angie contacted LW to begin the custody process, while Jim met with Joshua to discuss purchasing a piece of land large enough to build a home for himself, his children, and an addition for his mother. To sweeten the deal, he even offered his current home to Linda's parents if they wanted to stay nearby and remain part of their grandchildren's lives. With Emma by his side, Jim felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Emma accompanied him to meet with the architect, where they discussed the design of the house. To Jim's relief, things went more smoothly than he had feared. Although some of his past actions raised a few moral questions, nothing he had done was illegal. To his surprise, Linda's parents were supportive of his plans. Angie and LW acted as intermediaries, delivering the news to them in person, explaining that Jim believed they wouldn't want to hear from him directly. But when word came back, Jim was shocked. His former in-laws were eager to reconcile. They expressed regret for how things had turned out and even offered their full support. In the meantime, life continued to improve. Jim's small construction business began to grow, and with each passing day, his sense of direction became clearer. He wasn't running anymore, he was building a future, one step at a time. Late one afternoon, as Jim worked on the initial designs for the house, Emma walked up to him with a smile. "LW will be here soon," she said softly. "But for now, let's just enjoy the quiet." Jim looked at her, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. With Emma beside him and his life finally moving forward, he knew he could handle whatever came next. "I don't know what else I could have done back then," Jim said, exhaling slowly. "It felt like I didn't have a choice. But now, talking about it, it's strange. It's like a weight's being lifted off my shoulders. I know it sounds like a cliché, but it's true." Emma listened quietly, her eyes softening as he spoke. A hint of relief flickered across her face, though she kept her composure. There was something about her quiet understanding that made it easier for Jim to open up, even about things he hadn't wanted to face himself. Weeks turned into months, and life began to shift. Jim and Emma crossed paths often, sometimes by chance, other times by design. It started with casual conversations and ice cream outings, but over time, they grew closer. With each passing day, Jim felt more like the man he used to be, and for the first time in years, the future didn't seem so daunting. One Thursday, Jim heard about a barbecue at Joshua and Mai's house. They had invited him to join, and though he hadn't planned on attending, something told him he should go. Figuring a change of pace would do him some good, he decided to take Saturday off and prepare for an evening of food, drinks, and conversation. That Friday, he picked Angie up from the airport. She greeted him with her usual warmth, her light-hearted attitude lifting some of the tension from the air. "We've got this, Jim. You'll see," she said with a grin as they headed back to town. By the time Saturday rolled around, Jim found himself standing outside the courthouse, nerves creeping in despite Angie's reassurances. Before he could dwell on the gravity of what was about to happen, Linda's father approached him, offering a firm pat on the shoulder. "We're behind you, son," he said sincerely. "She had her chance, it's your turn now. Just keep your cool in there." Jim, overwhelmed by the unexpected show of support, pulled the older man into a tight hug. "Thank you," he murmured. "Thank you, Dad." Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Jim sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by LW and Angie, while Linda's parents and his mother sat directly behind him. Across the room, Linda and her legal team were at the defense table, casting occasional glances in his direction. Scattered in the gallery were a few spectators, including two reporters who looked bored and disinterested. When proceedings began, Linda's lawyer wasted no time in questioning her. "Miss Kramer, can you explain why you chose to divorce Mr. Carlyle?" Jim tensed, ready to speak up, but before he could, LW gave him a reassuring tap on the arm. "Not yet," he whispered calmly. Linda's voice trembled as she began her story. "It was a difficult time. We went out dancing at Morrison's, trying to lift our spirits, but we ended up arguing Anne." "Objection!" LW interrupted sharply, rising to his feet. The judge frowned. "On what grounds?" "Her statement misrepresents key facts, Your Honor," LW responded with measured calm. After a brief pause, the judge nodded in agreement. "Sustained. Please swear in the witness." The bailiff approached Jim, holding a Bible. "Place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand." "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do, Jim said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. State your name and address for the record. James Carlisle. Hideaway Marina, Golden Beach, Maryland. Proceed, Mr. Carlisle. You may recount the events in question. Taking a steady breath, Jim began his testimony. He described what had happened in detail, choosing his words carefully to remain truthful but not inflammatory. By the time he returned to his seat, the courtroom had fallen into an uneasy silence. Your Honor, Angie said, rising to speak, there are individuals present who can attest to Mr. Carlisle's character and provide additional context regarding his situation. The judge gave a curt nod. One by one, members of the community stepped forward to vouch for Jim, Joshua, Sally from the diner, and finally Emma, each offering heartfelt accounts of the man they had come to know and respect. Just as the trial seemed to be wrapping up, chaos erupted on the defense's side. Linda was nowhere to be found. Her legal team scrambled to salvage the situation, ultimately presenting signed and notarized documents in which Linda conceded to all of Jim's claims and relinquished her parental rights. Stunned, Jim sat motionless as LW and Angie explained what it meant. So, what happens now? He asked, still trying to process the abrupt turn of events. It means you've won, LW said gently. She's given up her rights, and since the divorce was already finalized, this was the last hurdle. Angie placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a comforting smile. It's over, Jim. You can move forward now. Later that afternoon, Jim gathered his children and suggested, how about we head over to your grandparents' place for lunch? You'll meet some of my friends. The kids eagerly agreed, piling into the grandparents' car. At the house, they joined a lively backyard gathering filled with laughter and good food. After lunch, Jim gathered everyone for an important conversation. Taking a deep breath, he began. Kids, your mom, she's gone. I don't know where she is, but we'll do our best to find her. For now, we just need to move forward. His daughter looked uncertain, but before she could say anything, Tommy spoke up, his voice clear and thoughtful. Is Emma going to be our new mom? Jim smiled, caught off guard by his son's maturity. I think that sounds like a good idea, buddy. In the following days, Jim shared his vision with the family. He proposed that they all move to Maryland, selling their current homes and starting fresh. The children, excited by the idea of living closer to the water and having their grandparents nearby, eagerly agreed. To Jim's surprise, even Linda's parents supported the plan, believing it would be the best move for everyone involved. Preparations began quickly, and within a few weeks, the family was ready to start their new chapter. Their farewell to New Orleans was simple but heartfelt. The trip back to Golden Beach was filled with quiet reflection, good food, and a shared sense of hope. Though Linda remained missing, Jim didn't let her absence define his future. Surrounded by love and support, he had rebuilt the life he once thought was lost. Was he happy? Yes. Had he made all the right choices? Maybe. But in that moment, standing with his family, he felt something even more important, gratitude. And for Jim, that was enough.